It was early evening when Jonathan Carter, a former Navy SEAL known for his sharp instincts and unwavering composure, pulled into a rest area off the quiet, desolate stretch of Highway 89. He'd been driving for hours, the hum of his truck's engine blending with the rhythmic patter of rain tapping against the windshield. The rest stop, dimly lit and weather-beaten, stood alone amidst a landscape of rolling plains and scattered pines, offering a momentary haven for travelers on this otherwise solitary road. But Jonathan had no idea that this brief stop would soon become a stage for a situation that would test his resolve in a way he hadn't experienced since his military days. Jonathan's boots splashed against the wet concrete as he stepped out, the chill of the evening air biting through his worn leather jacket. The fluorescent glow of the rest stop's lone diner flickered erratically, casting elongated shadows across the parking lot. Inside, the scene was deceptively ordinary, a couple of truckers sharing a muted conversation over coffee, an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, and a young family huddled near the counter. But it wasn't these everyday sights that caught Jonathan's attention. Seated near the window, isolated from the other patrons, was a small girl no older than 8. Her light brown curls framed a face pale with anxiety, and she wore a pastel yellow dress that seemed oddly formal for the casual setting. Across from her sat a man in his late 50s, tall and thin, with slicked back gray hair and an impeccably tailored navy blazer. His eyes, cold and calculating, shifted across the room before settling back on the girl with a gaze that made Jonathan's gut tighten. Jonathan moved to the coffee station, his military-honed senses on high alert. He poured himself a cup, watching the steam curl upwards, a temporary distraction from the disquiet gnawing at him. He glanced back at the girl and the man. The man's voice, low and clipped, was barely audible, but his stern expression spoke volumes. The girl's fingers trembled as they drummed an erratic rhythm on the tabletop. Every so often, her wide eyes darted nervously around the room, landing momentarily on Jonathan before skittering away as if she feared being caught. "Stop being paranoid," Jonathan told himself, taking a slow sip of his coffee. It was entirely possible that the man was her father or a guardian, albeit a stern one. Yet something about the girl's stiff posture and the haunted look in her eyes told a different story. A story Jonathan couldn't ignore. The quiet chatter of the diner did little to dispel the growing tension. Jonathan's gaze flickered over to the waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a friendly smile, who was busy taking an order from one of the truckers. When she moved to clear a table near the window, the girl seized the moment. Her hand rose slightly, palm outward, fingers splayed in a motion so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed. But Jonathan saw it. His chest tightened. It was the universal signal for help. His mind raced as he pieced together the implications. The man across from her seemed oblivious, too busy scanning the rest of the diner to notice the silent plea. Jonathan's hand clenched around the paper cup, crushing it slightly. Memories of covert missions flooded back. Moments where a misread signal could mean the difference between life and death. He pushed the memories away, focusing on the present. He needed to act, but charging in recklessly could escalate the situation. He needed confirmation. Jonathan took a seat at the counter, positioning himself with a clear view of the table where the girl sat. The man leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her eyes darted toward Jonathan again, and for a split second, desperation flashed in their depths before she quickly looked down. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the windows as if echoing the girl's silent fear. The man, sensing her tension, straightened up, his expression hardening. He set his newspaper down, folding it meticulously. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he noted the slight tremor in the man's hands and the way his jaw tensed when he glanced at his watch. The air between them crackled with an unspoken threat, one that Jonathan could no longer ignore. "Excuse me," he called out to the waitress, who turned toward him startled. "Mind if I get a refill?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. The waitress nodded and approached, her movements quick but practiced. As she poured, Jonathan leaned in slightly. "Do you know them?" he asked, tilting his head toward the man and the girl. The waitress hesitated, her eyes flicking over to the table. She shook her head. "Never seen them before," she said quietly. "But that little one, she looks scared, doesn't she?" Jonathan nodded subtly, the confirmation sending a jolt of determination through him. He had spent years trusting his instincts, and now they screamed at him that the girl was in danger. Setting down his cup, he stood, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. He approached the table, his stride confident but non-threatening, eyes locked on the man whose expression shifted from surprise to wary interest. "Evening," Jonathan said, his voice low but firm. The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone polite but edged with impatience. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the girl, who stared at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Everything okay here?" He directed the question at her, ignoring the man's attempt to cut him off with a dismissive wave. "We're fine," the man said, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Just a father and daughter having a meal." Jonathan didn't miss the subtle emphasis, the calculated attempt to claim normalcy. But the girl's silence spoke louder than any words. She shrank back slightly, her hands now clasped tightly in her lap as if trying to disappear into the vinyl seat. "Is that true?" Jonathan asked her gently, his eyes searching hers for any sign of reassurance or confirmation. The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, but a subtle shake of the man's head froze her in place. A tense silence settled over the table. Jonathan's pulse quickened, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a step back, hands up in a gesture of peace. "Just checking," he said, offering a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned and walked away, but not before catching the way the girl's eyes followed him, wide and pleading. Back at the counter, Jonathan pretended to sip his lukewarm coffee, his mind racing through options. The man's control over the girl was evident, and any sudden moves could put her at risk. He needed backup, and he needed it now. Slipping his phone from his pocket, he dialed 911, his voice low and urgent. "This is Jonathan Carter, former Navy SEAL," he said, his words clipped and precise. "I'm at the Creek View rest stop on Highway 89. I've got a situation involving a minor who may be in danger. I need assistance." The operator's voice was calm, professional. "Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. Please remain calm and avoid any direct confrontation unless the child is in immediate danger." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Remaining calm was never the issue. It was the waiting that gnawed at him. Minutes stretched like hours as he kept an eye on the table. The man's demeanor shifted. He leaned in closer to the girl, speaking in a voice so low that Jonathan couldn't catch the words. But he saw the way her small shoulders tensed, her eyes fixed on the rain-slicked window as if searching for an escape. Then, the man's hand closed around her arm. Not roughly, but with a grip firm enough to communicate control. Jonathan's vision narrowed, his heart pounding as he braced for what might come next. Just then, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder by the second. The man's eyes darted toward the entrance, a flash of alarm crossing his features. Jonathan stood, his muscles tensed like coiled wire. The girl's eyes met his one last time, wide and filled with a desperate. The sirens drew closer, their high-pitched wail cutting through the thick tension in the diner. Jonathan Carter's pulse thrummed in his ears, every nerve in his body taut as he prepared for whatever would come next. The rain pelted harder against the large glass windows, each drop like a drumbeat counting down to the moment of action. The girl, still seated across from the older man, now clutched her small hands tightly on her lap, eyes wide and unblinking. The man's expression had morphed from wary composure to open alarm, his jaw clenched and eyes darting nervously to the entrance. Jonathan's mind raced with calculated precision, weighing each potential move. He knew that the situation was about to escalate, and any wrong action could endanger the girl further. Stepping forward slightly, he maintained a composed exterior while his muscles coiled like a predator ready to spring. His hand twitched instinctively toward his belt, where in the past a holstered weapon would have been. Now, he had nothing but his training and instincts to rely on. The diner's door burst open, letting in a gust of cold, rain-laced wind that swept across the room, rattling napkins and menus. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their expressions a mix of urgency and controlled determination. The older man's eyes widened for a split second, a tremor of panic flashing across his face before he masked it with a tight, forced smile. "Evening, officers," he said, his voice strained but measured. He released the girl's arm, setting it back on the table as though trying to project nonchalance. But Jonathan didn't miss the slight tremor in his fingers or the way the girl's shoulders relaxed minutely, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, his eyes shifting between the man and the girl. Jonathan took a step forward, drawing their attention. "I called," Jonathan said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "The girl, she signaled for help." The younger officer, a lean man with sharp eyes, moved closer to the table, his hand hovering near his holster. "Sir, could we ask you to stand up, please?" The man's eyes narrowed, his smile faltering. "Is there a problem? She's my niece. We were just having dinner," he said, his voice climbing a notch higher, tension fraying its edges. The girl's gaze remained fixed on the tabletop, her small body rigid with tension. Jonathan's chest tightened as he took in her silence, the way she seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. He knew that silence. It was the silence of fear, learned and practiced. "Miss," the older officer said gently, bending down to meet her eye level, "are you okay? Is this man related to you?" The girl's eyes flicked up, meeting Jonathan's for a fleeting second before shifting to the officer. She opened her mouth, her lower lip trembling. She began, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the ambient noise of the diner. The man's fingers twitched as if ready to move, but the officer's presence held him in place. Jonathan stepped in, voice calm but laced with authority. "Take your time, sweetheart. You're safe now." His words seemed to unlock something in her, and she took a shaky breath. He's not my uncle," she whispered, the confession slipping out like a secret she'd carried for too long. The older man's mask cracked, a flash of fury in his eyes before he forced it back down. But it was too late. The officers had seen it. "Step away from the table, sir," the younger officer said, his tone now firm and commanding. The man's hesitation was brief but palpable before he slowly pushed back his chair and stood. His eyes darted around the diner, calculating, searching for an exit. But Jonathan moved subtly, positioning himself between the man and the front door. "No sudden moves," Jonathan said, his voice a low warning. The man's jaw clenched, muscles tensing as if debating whether to make a run for it. The officer stepped in quickly, hands on his arms, guiding him away from the table. The girl flinched as the commotion swirled around her, her hands clenching into fists so tight that her knuckles turned white. Jonathan felt a pang of protectiveness rise in him, sharp and fierce. "It's okay," he said softly, leaning down so that she could hear him over the noise. "You did the right thing." Her wide eyes met his, brimming with unshed tears, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of relief break through the fear. As the officers led the man out, his protests growing louder and more indignant, the tension in the diner began to ease, replaced by the hum of whispered conversations and the scrape of chairs as patrons shifted uneasily. Jonathan stayed close to the girl, a steady presence amidst the uncertainty. One of the officers approached him, a nod of respect in his expression. "We'll need a statement," he said. Jonathan nodded, his focus still on the girl, who now sat with her shoulders sagging in exhaustion, but no longer alone. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the most important battle had already been won. The hours that followed were a blur of questions, paperwork, and explanations. Jonathan Carter sat in a chair at the local police station, the fluorescent lights casting a stark glow that made the exhaustion settling in his bones even heavier. The steady hum of officers talking and the occasional ring of a phone filled the background, but his focus remained fixed on the small figure huddled a few feet away. The girl, who had finally shared her name, Emily, sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes downcast, as a kind-faced female officer spoke to her in soothing tones. Jonathan's mind replayed the scene in the diner, each detail sharpening with clarity. The way Emily's hand had risen with that subtle, desperate gesture. The fear in her eyes that spoke of unspeakable truths. He'd acted on instinct, a part of him still wired to protect, to intervene. And now he was here, committed to seeing this through. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight. "Mr. Carter." A voice broke his reverie, and he turned to see Officer Reynolds, the younger cop from the diner, standing with a clipboard in hand. His expression was one of weary gratitude. "I need you to go over your statement one more time." Jonathan nodded, shifting in his seat. "Of course." His voice, deep and steady, recounted everything he had observed. The tension, the silent pleas, the man's suspicious behavior. Each word felt heavier than the last, as if speaking them gave weight to the gravity of what had almost transpired. When he finished, Reynolds exhaled, setting down the clipboard. "You did the right thing. Emily's safe now, thanks to you." There was a pause, the kind that carries unspoken thoughts. The man we detained, he's not who he claimed to be. We're still piecing it together, but it seems like there's more to this. Jonathan's jaw tightened, a mix of relief and simmering anger coursing through him. The idea that someone could harm a child, use fear as a leash, it reignited a fire he hadn't felt since leaving the military. "What about Emily?" he asked, eyes drifting back to the girl, who now clutched a cup of warm cocoa with both hands, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized blanket. Reynolds followed his gaze, the lines around his eyes softening. "Child Services has been contacted, and we're trying to reach any known relatives. But so far, it seems like she's been isolated for a while." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "She's been through more than any kid should." Jonathan's chest ached at the thought. His gaze met Emily's, and for a moment, her eyes met his. There was still fear, yes, but now it was mixed with something fragile. Trust. It was a tenuous thread, but one that he wasn't willing to let break. A few moments later, the female officer approached him. "Emily would like to see you," she said softly. Jonathan's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he nodded, standing up and stretching his tired muscles. He walked over, each step bringing a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Emily's eyes, wide and cautious, watched him approach. He crouched down to meet her at eye level, offering a small smile. "Hi, Emily," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Hi," she whispered, barely audible. There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her voice wavering. "Thank you." Jonathan's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate. "You're safe now," he managed, the conviction in his tone steady and unyielding. Emily's eyes glistened, and she looked down, tracing a finger along the edge of the blanket. "I was so scared," she admitted, the words breaking through a dam of silence. Jonathan's heart ached at the rawness of her confession. "I know," he said, "but you were brave. So brave. And now, everything's going to be okay." The room seemed to exhale with them, the tension that had gripped the station finally easing as the storm outside began to wane. But Jonathan knew that this was only the beginning. There would be investigations, more questions, and for Emily, a path to healing that would take time. Yet, as he sat beside her, the unspoken promise between them was clear. She would not face any of it alone. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft golden hues through the blinds of the police station's waiting room. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside washed clean, as if it, too, had taken a breath after the long night. Jonathan Carter sat on the worn vinyl chair, exhaustion tugging at the edges of his awareness. He'd given his full statement, answered follow-up questions, and waited patiently while the officers coordinated with child services. Despite the weariness in his bones, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Across the room, Emily sat, still wrapped in the oversized blanket, her small fingers now fiddling with the edge in absent patterns. The cup of cocoa had long since cooled, abandoned on the table beside her. The female officer, Officer Daniels, hovered nearby, her kind eyes keeping a watchful gaze on the girl. "Hey, Jonathan." Officer Reynolds's voice broke the early morning quiet. Jonathan looked up, noting the tired smile on the young cop's face. "Child services is on their way. They're looking into any family she might have, but it's going to take some time." His voice softened. "It's been a long night for everyone. You don't have to stay." Jonathan glanced at Emily, who sat so still she almost blended into the shadows. Leaving now felt wrong, like walking away from a mission half finished. "I'll wait," he said simply, the resolve in his voice leaving no room for argument. Reynolds nodded, understanding passing between them. "I figured you'd say that." With a clap on the shoulder, he turned back to the busy hallway, where officers were deep in conversation and the quiet chaos of paperwork continued. Minutes ticked by, each one measured by the soft ticking of the clock and the muffled sound of distant voices. Emily shifted, drawing Jonathan's attention. She met his gaze with a tentative look, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Are you okay?" Jonathan asked, his tone gentle but steady. The question seemed to anchor her, and she nodded slightly. Is he gone?" she whispered, eyes darting toward the hallway as if expecting the man to reappear. Jonathan's expression hardened, but his voice remained soft. "Yes, he won't hurt you again." The reassurance seemed to ease some of the tension in her small frame, though she still held the blanket close like a shield. A beat of silence passed between them, fragile but charged with unspoken emotions. Then Emily surprised him, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Can I stay with you until they find someone?" Jonathan's heart clenched, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. The logical part of him knew that it wasn't up to him, that protocols existed and there were procedures to follow. But in that moment, the look in Emily's eyes made all those barriers seem inconsequential. Before he could respond, Officer Daniels stepped forward, a gentle smile on her face. "We'll make sure you're safe, sweetheart. Mr. Carter can visit, if that's okay with him." Her eyes flickered to Jonathan, silently asking for his cooperation. Jonathan nodded, forcing a smile that he hoped conveyed more confidence than he felt. "Of course. I'll be around, Emily." The promise hung between them, quiet but solid. The door to the station opened, and a woman from child services entered, her professional demeanor softened by the empathetic tilt of her head. She spoke briefly with Officer Daniels, then approached Emily, crouching down to introduce herself. "Hi, Emily. I'm Lisa, and I'm here to help take care of you. We're going to find a safe place for you to stay, okay?" Her voice was kind, practiced in its reassurance. Emily glanced at Jonathan, hesitation flickering across her face. But when she saw him nod, she seemed to draw strength from it. "Okay," she replied, her voice small but steady. Jonathan stood as Lisa gently took Emily's hand. "Thank you," he said, his eyes meeting Lisa's with a gratitude that transcended words. "You're welcome," she replied, understanding the unspoken message. As Emily was led away, she looked back one last time. Their eyes met, and Jonathan lifted a hand in a silent farewell, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. She responded in kind, a glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes as she disappeared down the hallway. Jonathan stood there for a moment longer, the early sunlight filtering in, illuminating the room in a soft glow. The night had been long, The road ahead for Emily even longer. But as he walked out of the police station into the new day, he knew he would be there, a constant presence in the background, ready to help if needed. The battle was far from over, but hope had found a foothold, and that was enough for now. Days turned into weeks, and the echoes of that long night at the police station began to soften. Jonathan Carter resumed his routine, returning to the quiet life he had built for himself after leaving the Navy. Yet the memory of Emily's wide, frightened eyes lingered, resurfacing during the quiet moments when the world seemed still. He had followed up with Officer Reynolds and learned that Emily was staying at a foster home while the search for her relatives continued. Each update brought a mix of relief and concern. She was safe for now, but her future remained uncertain. One crisp afternoon, as autumn leaves painted the streets in warm shades of gold and crimson, Jonathan received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end belonged to Lisa from Child Services. "Mr. Carter, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, a touch of warmth in her tone. "Not at all," Jonathan replied, curiosity sparking within him. "Emily's been asking about you," Lisa continued. "She's adjusting well, but it seems like you're someone who made a big difference in her life. We'd like to invite you to visit if you're willing." The tightness that Jonathan hadn't realized he carried began to ease. "I'd be happy to," he said, the words coming more easily than he expected. A few days later, Jonathan found himself standing in front of a modest brick house, its yard scattered with the toys and laughter of children playing. The foster home was warm and inviting, a beacon of normalcy amidst the turbulence Emily had endured. When Lisa opened the door, her smile was genuine, and the soft murmur of children's voices drifted out to meet him. "She's in the back," Lisa said, leading him through the hallway decorated with finger paintings and framed handprints. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, a comforting scent that spoke of home. Jonathan's heart thudded as he stepped onto the porch where Emily sat on a swing, her legs swinging idly back and forth. She looked up, eyes brightening as they met his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, a smile spread across her face, shy but sincere. "Hi, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice stronger than he remembered. "Hi, Emily," Jonathan responded, his own smile breaking through. He took a seat on the porch steps, watching her as she pushed off the ground, the creak of the swing filling the silence. "Are you okay?" he asked after a moment. Emily nodded, her gaze thoughtful as she stared out at the yard. "I am now," she said. Her small fingers toyed with the chain of the swing, a gesture that spoke of lingering nerves but also of resilience. "Good," Jonathan said, the single word holding a wealth of emotion. They sat in companionable silence, the sounds of other children's laughter and the rustle of leaves creating a backdrop of peace. Emily's smile widened as she glanced back at him, her eyes filled with trust and the quiet assurance that she was no longer alone. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice drifting on the autumn breeze. "I'll always come," Jonathan promised, and he knew that he meant it, that he would be there as much as she needed, whenever she needed. The path ahead for Emily would be long, but she would not walk it alone. And for Jonathan, that realization was enough to fill the empty spaces in his own heart. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that mingled with the last rays of golden light, Jonathan felt something shift. The weight of his past, the battles and the silence that followed, seemed to lift just a bit. Here, in the laughter of children and the strength of one little girl's smile, he found a renewed sense of purpose. A reminder that the most important battles weren't always fought on distant shores, but in the quiet moments when choosing to care made all the difference. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of compassion and connection, please consider subscribing to our channel. Here, we share inspiring stories that highlight the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected heroes among us. Your support helps us continue bringing these heartfelt stories to life. Don't forget to like, comment, and share with those who need a little hope today. Thank you for being part of our community.